That's me in my Tibetan Book of the Dead period. And the expression Tomorrow Never Knows was another of Ringo's. So I gave it a throwaway title because I was a bit self-conscious about the lyrics of Tomorrow Never Knows. So I took one of Ringo's malapropisms to take the edge off the heavy philosophical lyrics.
A 5-month break from the studio for a popular recording group is usually a refreshing experience, used to reassess their artistic direction. This has actually become quite standard as time has progressed. A lot of bands today might take a 1-year or even a 2-year break before they make a new album, or even release a single. For the music industry of the 60s, though, 5 months was an eternity. The 13-hour marathon session of November 11th, 1965, yielded 2 amazingly melodic pop standards, and the finishing touches to 2 others, all of which graced the excellent Rubber Soul. John's main contribution on this day, namely the beautifully poignant Girl, exhibited a lyrical maturity that appeared to pave the way for further innovations from its composer. His creativity at this point was admittedly being fueled by his frequent use of softer drugs such as marijuana, but John's obsession with LSD in 1966 was to change his songwriting output drastically. I can't imagine anyone expecting what was next to come from John's pen nearly 5 months later. It seems that even his fellow bandmates were equally flabbergasted, but eager to blaze this new trail. Probably never before in pop music history could a 5-month break result in such a flagrant new direction as did the unveiling of what became Tomorrow Never Knows. The inspiration for the song came from a 1964 book by Timothy Leary, Ralph Metzner, and Robert Alpert, called The Psychedelic Experience, a manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Leary had spent 7 months in the Himalayas studying Tibetan Buddhism under Lama Govinda. The book was a direct result of this period of study. Leary himself explains, "The Book of the Dead really means the Book of the Dying, but it's your ego rather than your body that is dying. The book is a classic. It's the Bible of Tibetan Buddhism. The concept of Buddhism is of the void, and of reaching the void." Leary admittedly intended his book, The Psychedelic Experience, to be enjoyed along with experiencing psychedelic drugs. The final chapter, entitled Instructions for Use During a Psychedelic Session, being a dead giveaway, which were then starting to become quite popular. Barry Miles, a close friend of the Beatles, ran Indica Books in London, and, as requested by the boys, sent them significant pieces of literature concerning the countercultural when he obtained them. Miles remembered John visiting with Paul in search of something by Nietzsche. Having handed him the portable Nietzsche, Miles showed John a book that had just arrived, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. John was delighted, Miles remembered, and curled up with the book in an old sofa that we had in the middle of the shop. For those who were newly enamored with LSD in the 60s, as John was, a thirst for deeper meaning was desired in order to make sense of the sensory images and unpredictable effects that were experienced when taking the drug. John took it with him on his vacation to Trinidad in January of '66. Before his flight, he recorded a spoken word tape in the attic studio of his Kenwood home, which was to be used for his intended purpose of personally delving deeper into the LSD experience. Leary suggests making such a tape to play back to yourself during an acid trip, the moment you sense you're moving into a dangerous course, which was John's experience in past trips. With the final chapter of Leary's book in front of him, John recorded, "Oh, John Lennon, the time has come for you to seek new levels of reality. Your ego and the rock and roll game are about to cease. You are about to set face to face with the clear light. That which is called ego death is coming to you. This is now the hour of death and rebirth. Do not fear it. Surrender to it. Join it. It is part of you. You are part of it. Remember also, beyond the restless flowing electricity of life is the ultimate reality, the void." He was soon writing a song using some of the actual lines from Leary, including his description of the state of grace beyond reality, using the working title, The Void. The void was the term employed by the translators of the Tibetan Book of the Dead for the region in which the soul finds itself after death. Paul relinquishes any doubt as to who was the entire composer of this track by saying, "Tomorrow Never Knows" was definitely John's. I remember John coming to Brian Epstein's house at 24 Chapel Street in Belgravia when we got back together after a break, and we were there for a meeting. George Martin was there, so it may have been to show George some new songs or to talk about the new album. John got his guitar out and started doing Tomorrow Never Knows, and it was all on one chord. This was because of our interest in Indian music. Normally, we'd say to George Martin, "Here, George, there's this song." There'd be a few chords, a few lyrics, a few bits of things you could understand, a hook, a riff. But this one was all on C. It never changed off C. This was one thing I always gave George Martin great credit for. He was a slightly older man, and we were pretty far out. But he didn't flinch at all when John played it to him. He just said, I see. Yes." He could have said, "Bloody hell, it's terrible." I think George was always intrigued to see what direction we'd gone in, probably in his mind thinking, "How can I make this into a record?" But by that point, he was starting to trust that we must know vaguely what we were doing. But the material was really outside of his realm. As was usually the case in the Beatles' recording history, the first song to be tackled for a new album was a Lennon creation. One noteworthy new development in Beatles history that occurred on April 6th was the employ of 20-year-old Geoff Emerick as primary engineer. Norman Smith had been the Beatles engineer for the vast majority of their sessions up to this point. But, because of his promotion to producer, new band Pink Floyd being one of his first artists, advantage was taken to get some young blood in the studio to help satisfy the Beatles' cravings for innovations in the recording process. Having worked with them on various occasions in the past as a second engineer, the group was somewhat familiar with him personally. His new role as primary engineer would test his creativity and ultimately win them over as one who could fulfill their quest for expanding the sonic landscape. Emerick remembers, "My ears perked up when I heard John's direction to George Martin. I want my voice to sound like the Dalai Lama chanting from a mountaintop, miles away. I'd imagined, in my head, that in the background you could hear thousands of monks chanting." John explained in '67. "That was impractical, of course, and we did something different. I should have tried to get near my original idea, the monks singing. I realize now that was what I wanted." Emerick continues, "George Martin looked over at me with a nod, and he reassured John. Got it. I'm sure Geoff and I will come up with something." Which meant, of course, that he was sure Geoff would come up with something. I looked around the room in a panic. I thought I had a vague idea of what John wanted, but I had no clear sense of how to achieve it. George Martin adds, "I knew that ordinary echo or reverb wouldn't work, because it would just be a very distant voice. We needed to have something a bit weird and metallic. I've never been to Tibet, but when I thought of Dalai Lama, I thought of alpenhorns, and I imagined what the voice would sound coming out of one of those long horns. In the meantime, John wanted to make a tape loop of himself on guitar and Ringo on drums, something that fortunately George Martin was familiar with, especially with his 1962 Raid Cathode release entitled Time Beat. I used to do a lot of experimenting with musique concrète, speeding up tapes, making funny noises, and plucking piano strings, that kind of thing." Emerick continues, "Fortunately, I had a little time to think about it, because John decided to start the recording process by having me make a loop of him playing a simple guitar figure, with Ringo accompanying him on drums. Because John wanted a thunderous sound, the decision was made to play the part at a fast tempo and then slow the tape down on playback. This would serve not only to return the tempo to the desired speed, but also to make the guitar and drums, and the reverb they were drenched in, sound otherworldly. Simultaneous to Ringo providing the drum pattern along with the tape loop was John overdubbing lead vocals, using an innovative new effect. Emerick says, "The studio's Hammond organ was hooked up to a system called a Leslie, a large wooden box that contained an amp and two sets of revolving speakers, one that carried low bass frequencies and the other that carried high treble. No one had ever put a vocal through it. I think I have an idea for what to do for John's voice. I announced to George in the control room as we finished editing the loop. Excitedly, I explained my concept to him. Though his brows furrowed for a moment, he nodded his assent. Then he went out into the studio and told the 4 Beatles, who were standing around impatiently, waiting for the loop to be constructed, to take a tea break while Geoff sorts out something for the vocal.
Turn off your mind, relax and float downstream.
John's voice sounded like it never had before, eerily disconnected, distant yet compelling. The effect seemed to perfectly complement the esoteric lyrics he was chanting. Everyone in the control room looked stunned. Through the glass, we could see John begin smiling. At the end of the first verse, he gave an exuberant thumbs up, and Paul and George Harrison began slapping each other on the back. "It's the Dalai Lennon!" Paul shouted. "That is bloody marvelous!" John kept saying over and over again. While listening to the playback, John and George Harrison had been excitedly discussing ideas for guitar parts. George eagerly suggested that a tambura, one of his new collections of Indian instruments, be added. "It's perfect for this track, John," he was explaining. "It's just kind of a droning sound, and I think it'll make the whole thing quite Eastern." Meanwhile, Paul was suggesting to Ringo to add a little skip to the basic beat he was playing. Ringo said little, but listened intently. He was used to taking direction from the others. "I think we've got it," John announced excitedly after the last note died away. George Martin waved everyone into the control room to hear the playback. "That's the one, boys," George Martin agreed. Everyone went home and made up a spool, a loop, George Harrison explained. "Okay, class, now I want you all to go home and come back in the morning with your own loop. We were kind of touching on the Stockhausen kind of avant-garde clue music." "I was into tape loops at the time," explained Paul. "I had 2 Brennell machines, and I could create tape loops with them. I used to get a lot of seagulls in my loops. A speeded-up shout goes squawk squawk, and I always get pictures of the seaside, of Torquay, the Torbay Inn, fishing boats and puffins, and deep purple mountains. Those were the slowed-down ones. So we made up our little loops and we brought them to the studio." George Harrison continues, "I think they were just weird noises. I don't exactly recall what was on my loop. I think it was a grandfather clock, but at a different speed. You could do it with anything. Pick a little piece and then edit it, connect it up to itself, and play it at a different speed." On the following day, April 7th, Phil McDonald carefully threaded each loop onto the tape machine, one at a time, so that they could audition them. Paul had assembled an extraordinary collection of bizarre sounds, which included his playing distorted guitar and bass, as well as wine glasses ringing, and other indecipherable noises. They played them every conceivable way. Proper speed, sped up, slowed down, backwards, forwards. Every now and then, one of the Beatles would shout, "That's a good one," as they played through the lot. Eventually, 5 of the loops were selected to be added to the basic backing track. Emerick says, "We had no sense of the momentousness of what we were doing. It all just seemed like a bit of fun and a good cause at the time. But what we created that afternoon was actually the forerunner of today's beat and loop-driven music. Being the most unconventionally structured song in the Beatles' catalog to date, it consists only of verses, if John Lennon even considered them as verses at all. Since his intention was to mimic the Indian music that they were coming to admire in 1966, the format used on this track completely diverted their attention away from any pop structure with normal bridges, refrains, or choruses. Even the ultra-Eastern songs Love You Too and Within You Without You included refrains. Tomorrow Never Knows was a great innovation, George Martin proudly recalls. John wanted a very spooky kind of track, a very ethereal sound. Paul at the same time was probably more avant-garde than the other boys. We always think of John as being the avant-garde one, with Yoko and so on. But at the same time, Paul was heavily into Stockhausen and John Cage and all the avant-garde artists, while John was living a comfortable suburban life in Weybridge. While Paul never contested that Tomorrow Never Knows was a full John Lennon composition, his input was extremely instrumental in creating the psychedelic landscape that finished off the Revolver listening experience. Thus became another example of the brilliant Lennon-McCartney partnership, one that will probably never be equaled.